Guns play an important role in American history. An armed militia took us from colony to country. The right to bear arms, written in the Constitution.
He's outside the car.
Mass shootings at Columbine High, Newtown, Connecticut, and here at Seattle Pacific University have many pushing for tighter controls on guns. Others argue these measures fail to cut crime and instead curb our freedom. Washington's November ballot sits in the crosshairs of this heated debate, with two initiatives on opposite sides of the issue. Tonight, we turn the discussion over to you. Live from KOMO Plaza in Seattle, Washington, a town hall meeting, Guns in America. Please welcome the moderator, Sinclair commentator and host, Mark Hyman.
The Second Amendment to the Constitution guarantees the right to keep and bear arms. So does the Washington State Constitution. But are there reasonable limitations and regulations? Supporters of stricter gun laws may argue that they want to prevent mass shootings like that happened at Sandy Hook Elementary School. Supporters of status quo may claim that there was a reduction of violence in Chicago as a result of concealed carry permits. Good evening, I'm Mark Hyman, host of Behind the Headlines. Thank you for joining us. On the first Tuesday in November, Washington voters get to decide which argument they favor. Now, we've got a packed audience here, anxious to get started with a lot of great questions. But you at home can also join us in this important discussion. I'll tell you how to do that in just a moment. But first, we've assembled a terrific panel of experts who will debate the issue and answer your questions. So let's go ahead and meet them. Joining us this evening is Phil Watson. He's Director of Special Projects of the Second Amendment Foundation. Phil Shave. He is Executive Director of the Washington Arms Collectors. Rebecca Johnson-Arledge. She is with the Washington Alliance for Gun Responsibility. And Ralph Fascitelli. He is Board President of Washington Ceasefire. Additional information on our panelists and organizations may be found on our website at komonews.com. Our panelists are here in their personal capacities. The views they represent are their own unless they state otherwise. Now, I mentioned a moment ago, we have a live audience here, anxious to get started with a lot of great questions, but you at home can also join us. A question we ask live on air may be yours. KOMO News reporter John Humbert is manning our social media desk. He'll explain how you can be a part of this debate. John?
Well, we've got some good stuff already. We've had a number of folks come through, Mark, and we definitely want to hear more from you. That hashtag is going to be incredibly important. Your voice, your future, that's what we're all about tonight, Mark.
I need a shot of them. What are you doing?
Thanks, John. Now, this is all about asking questions of our panel of experts. That's what a town hall meeting is all about. However, tonight we're going to start off with the first question tonight, not going to our panel, but to the live audience here. I'd like you to respond to this question with the sound of applause. Your two choices and answers are yes and no. Please respond to this question. Is there anything that could have absolutely prevented the mass shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary School or similar mass shootings? Those who believe yes, please applaud. Those who believe no, please applaud. Well, I'd like to put the same question to our panel of experts if you raise your hand. Is there anything that could have prevented the mass shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary School or similar shootings? If you believe yes, please raise your hand. Okay, two. And if you believe no? So we've got two and a half. Sir, if you step up here for just a moment. Okay, so we have a little division here, both in the panelists and the audience. Step on up here with me, sir. We're going to start the evening off with our first question. Sir, please tell us who you are, where do you live, and what is your question?
My name is David Carnahan. I live in Tacoma. I'm trying to start a range down in the Tacoma area, and I want to know how I-94 would impact any of the instructors that I hire to give free training to any individual that seeks safety training on firearms.
Let's start off with Ralph. How would this impact someone who's running a range?
I believe it wouldn't impact it at all. You know, I think you're going to hear a lot of conversation about how long this initiative is, how it's all the transfers. But the fact is, when it comes to sporting programs, and what should be considered a sporting program, there are a number of exceptions to it, and I think it wouldn't impact you at all.
Philip Shave.
I can't believe the answer. 594 specifically requires the intervention of an FFL dealer in a transfer, and a transfer is a change of possession. No money needs to change hands. It is not a sale. You've heard a lot about 594 as a background check on private firearm sales. It is much more than that. 594 actually does have an exception that would allow an instructor to transfer firearms to a juvenile, to a child. There is no exception for adults.
We're back to the audience.
It's not true. First of all, you can transfer to family members. You can transfer even to first cousins. So one of the reasons this is 18 pages long, as I'm sure we're going to hear from this side, is because I think our side of the equation really took careful consideration to make sure that innocent people, well-intended people, were not going to be vulnerable to this. In fact, a key part of this initiative is that there has to be an intent to defraud and go around the law. If there is not an intent, then there's not going to be any criminal conviction for anybody.
Phil?
I cannot envision this gentleman's new range and training program to be a family limited affair that has nothing but family members in it that meet the exceptions within the law. It just isn't going to work that way. And the word intent is not used in 594. We've had a year or more to look at it. We've had lawyers and police officers in the room. We've examined it. And to tell you the truth, every time we look at it, it looks a little different.
All right, I'm going back to the audience. Please tell us who you are, where do you live, and what is your question?
Cheryl Berenson, I'm from Seattle. My question is for Mr. Watson. Mr. Watson, you were in the room when the NRA lobbyist here in Washington compared Initiative 594 to Nazi policies that caused the Holocaust. Since then, the head of Initiative 591 campaign has made that same comparison. As a member of the Holocaust Education Resource Center here in Seattle, I'd like to know if you agree with them, and what is that position for 591 now?
First of all, Alan, who was the chairman of 591, didn't necessarily make the exact equivalent comparisons. But if you go historically into the facts of gun control in 1930s and 1940s Germany, there was a registration of people for firearms, and they did use that registration system to take those firearms away. And I would like to say that we did a merger this week with Jews for the Preservation of Firearms Ownership. So we're very, very sensitive to those issues, and Alan is Jewish himself. So I hope that answers your question.
We haven't had a chance to hear from Rebecca. Would you have something you want to follow up with on that comment?
Gosh, on that comment, you know, the comments that Mr. Judy and Mr. Gottlieb have made equating supporters of common sense solutions that are closing a loophole to keep dangerous criminals from having guns, comparing that to Nazi Germany or insinuating that folks who are for closing that loophole don't understand that history feels very offensive to myself and I think to many Washingtonians.
We're only a few minutes in the evening. We have some passionate questions and some differences in opinions. Before we check in with what our viewers had to say at home, we're going to get one more question from our live audience here. Please tell us who you are, where do you live, and what is your question?
My name is Christina, and I live here in Seattle. I'm a firearms instructor. My question is actually from one of my students. She's a 35-year-old woman that takes private lessons from me, and her father owns a collection of guns that were passed down from her grandfather who served in World War II. There's about 7 of them. When her father passes, what happens to her right to own these guns after the 60-day time period?
Ralph, what happens?
I don't know the answer to that. I mean, what I do know... What I do know is that any gun that was produced before 1898 is considered to be an antique and considered to be exempt from the background check law. What I do know is that you can pass on and transfer a gun to anybody in the immediate family. So based on what you said, that's a pretty specific situation. If she transferred it on, I don't think there'd be any problem at all with this background check law.
Phil Shave?
That's not true. You mentioned the 60 days, and you have 60 days within which, if there are any handguns in that collection, you're required to either go down to an FFL dealer and transfer them, and the usual cost is somewhere between $30 and $50 per firearm, or you can contact Department of Licensing and register those firearms. So the people who tell you this is not a registration plan are wrong. You are required to register those inherited firearms within 60 days. Now, we have some attorneys in the room, some of whom handle estates, and they can tell you that a widow, a survivor, is not going to be thinking about firearms details and notifying Department of Licensing within that 60 days. It's unrealistic. Most people will probably not even know about the requirement to do that.
Ralph, you have a follow-up?
Well, you're going to hear the word registration or register a lot. You know, that's one of the boogeymen that Phil Side throws out there. And there is no registration or register involved in this at all. And in fact, you know, there's the National Information Computer System here that is the database everything gets checked against. But they must throw away the data they get. Let me finish my question. Within 24 hours. Only individual dealers can keep that information, and that information is not allowed to be shared. So register and registry are code words that the other side likes to hold out. But the fact is, we bend over backwards to actually protect the Second Amendment rights of all gun owners.
I'd like to remind my audience to not shout out and interrupt our panelists when they're giving their responses. Let's show them the respect they deserve. Now, we're 15 minutes into this. We're 15 minutes into this, and we already have a lot of disagreement of opinion. But the public has been weighing in on this issue for the past week or so. Viewers have joined us both on Facebook and Twitter. So let's check with our social media desk. John, what do you have for us?
Well, we've got a lot of energy and a lot of emotion out there. You know, when you talk about the disagreements, you've also got to talk about the passion that so many people have, but also some pointed questions, too. Clay Burris says to us, if I-594 is about simple background checks, how come it is 18 pages long? We mentioned that earlier. Those are some of the other concerns. Our next comment in all of this that people have come up and said, how exactly will I-594 stop gun-related violence, and how will it be reinforced? Lee Clement asks that. So we've got questions like that coming from people about these very tangible issues. What say those panelists, Mark?
That's a great question. So, Rebecca, it doesn't make a difference what law is passed any time. There will always be people who break laws. How do we go after those people who don't follow the law and continue to engage in gun violence?
I think that's a great question. You know, I raised my hand halfway on the first question because I don't believe there's any one thing that we can do that will prevent all gun violence. But closing the loophole that currently exists in our law where dangerous criminals, domestic abusers, the dangerously mentally ill can go online or meet someone at a gun show or a stranger in a parking lot to buy a gun without a background check at all, that's a loophole that just simply should be closed. So I would say to that, you know, we can't solve every instance of violence, but we know that in states that require background checks on more than just the gun sales that happen in stores, there are 38% fewer women are murdered by guns by a domestic partner or a spouse. About the same amount of fewer law enforcement are killed in the line of duty with a firearm. So voting yes on 594, passing this common sense closing of this loophole is a way for us to further enforce our laws and make sure dangerous people are not getting easy access to guns.
I want to bring Phil Watson back into the conversation. Do you agree with Rebecca?
Well, I think the real loophole is dangerous people to begin with. And if we've got people that are so extremely dangerous walking around out on the streets, or if they're a criminal, violent criminal, or if they're in need of mental health treatment, I think we need to deal with that situation first. I'm a season ticket holder with my family with the Seattle Sounders, and there was a person with severe mental issues that stabbed a Seattle Sounders fan just walking home earlier this year. So there's a lot of real issues here that we could be talking about, but instead the other side wants to try to distract and talk about attacking our firearms rights. And I just don't think that's the right course of action right now. I think we have to deal with the people that need treatment, or the people that probably, if they're really, really violent, should be in some sort of facility.
And before I follow up with Ralph, out of curiosity, is there anybody in the audience here who is a mental health professional? Anyone in the audience? Because that's a topic, I think. So we'll get to you. No, I'll get to you in a moment, sir. All right, so let me follow up with Ralph.
So I want to talk to Phil's point. In 2009, Washington ceasefire led the charge to change the law that denied gun rights to 5,000 involuntarily committed mentally ill patients. So, if people think you're a danger to yourself, society, you get committed for, I believe it's 72 hours. After that period, they still think you're committed. I think it's either 14 or 30 days. That's about 5,000 people. Now, we have now been able to deny the gun rights to those people, these mentally ill people, especially the people Phil talks about. The problem is with the gun show loophole, and about 40% of guns go without background checks through these gun shows.
It's not true, Ralph.
Let me finish my point. The problem is these people, these mentally ill people who are denied gun rights can go to a gun show where there's no background check. So this bill we're talking about lays the platform on everything else we want to do to deny gun rights from the mentally ill, from felons, from terrorists, and those charged with domestic violence.
All right, let me get a quick follow-up from Phil Watson, then we're going to move back on to the next audience member.
The Washington Post did a fact check on that statistic Ralph just talked about, 40% of people getting their firearms without some sort of background check, and they gave it 3 Pinocchios. That's the Washington Post. So Ralph, your nose is growing just a little bit right now.
This is something the other side doesn't understand. There's a matter of nuance here, okay? And it isn't all black and white. It isn't all good guys and bad guys out there. The lower number talk to people that got their guns directly from gun shows without a background check. But what we've seen, and we saw this in the case of the Forza Cafe, those 4 policemen who were shot and killed, the perpetrator got his gun from somebody who bought it at a gun show without a background check. So being able to buy these guns at gun shows without background checks create an easy secondary market. These guns flood into our children, the ones under 21 are not allowed guns. They flood into the hands of felons. And others we've talked about, the mentally ill. So there's a secondary market because you don't have record keeping of transactions at gun shows that are created when at these gun shows.
Phil, hold that thought for a moment. I suspect we're going to hear more about this throughout the evening. I want to get to this gentleman. Sir, please tell us who you are, where you live, and what is your question?
My name is Sandy Brown. I live in Seattle. And according to FBI statistics, in Washington State, 25,000 people who are convicted felons, 6,000 people who are guilty of domestic abuse, and 1,000 people who are severely mentally ill have been denied the ability to have guns because of the criminal background check system. And yet we hear the people on the anti-gun responsibility campaign saying that criminal background checks don't keep guns away from criminals. So how can you say that in your campaign when it's so blatantly untrue according to FBI statistics?
Phil Shave?
It's not a matter of nuance. I think it's a matter of fact. We're talking about the National Instant Check System, the NICS system. You'll hear that referred to during the debate. Well, it's just a matter of fact that court restraining orders in the state of Washington do not get into the NICS system. So we've got 594 that requires a NICS background check. That NICS background check is going to miss the domestic and the restraining order and all of those very urgent issues that should prevent someone from having a firearm. I'll tell you that NICS check is not the answer.
I'm going to bring Rebecca back in the conversation.
Thank you. Phil, I'm so glad that you talked about our local law enforcement checks because, in fact, what 594 says is that the check that you do when you conduct a sale with a private person or online is the same check that happens today when you buy a gun in a store. And that includes a NICS check, and it also includes a very important local law enforcement check for all handgun sales. That's closing the loophole. It's exactly the same check that that gun owners and hunters and others have been using in our state for many, many years when they buy guns from licensed dealers.
And I'll give both Ralph and Phil a chance for 2 quick follow-ups. Ralph?
Well, Rebecca's exactly right. It isn't just the NICS system. It also checks state databases as well. So Phil is wrong. You know, NICS is one database we check, but he is right in that not all people get sent up to NICS. Although Washington State does a better job on this, and there's been funds committed to that to make sure that the mentally ill and those in domestic violence do get into NICS. Not all do. That's why we check it against both NICS and state databases. So it's as close to foolproof as you can get.
And Phil Watson, you have a quick comment before we move on?
Well, that just came from the guy that said earlier he doesn't know what's in his own initiative. So I'm not, you know, just take everything with a grain of salt tonight. The real question here is, again, why are these people out on the street to begin with? They're not prosecuted. Are we just going to let them roam around and luck into a gun or steal a gun somewhere? These people who have already violated the law need to be prosecuted. There needs to be some consequences out there for these people, or they're going to continue to do this over and over and over again. That needs to be focused on, and it's not focused on enough. And the other side of the equation only wants to focus on gun owners. That's not going to work.
And later on this evening, I hope that we have a couple of law enforcement officers in the audience. If we do, we'd like to hear from them when it comes to the issue of prosecution. We're back to the audience. Please tell us who you are, where do you live, and what is your question?
My name is Cal Al-Sharif. I live in Bellevue. My question is that Washington gun owners have multiple ways of proving that they've passed a background check, such as a curio and relic collector's license from the ATF, a concealed pistol license from their local police department, and I believe a WAC membership card requires a background check. Why do people who can prove with documentation that they've passed a background check and that the police and ATF know that they're buying firearms have to pass yet another background check?
You don't have You only pass a background check when you buy a gun, okay? And so there's not another background check. If you don't want to buy another gun, then you don't have to pass another background check.
No. That wasn't even responsive to his question. He very clearly stated that other background checks are done, and they are more thorough than the NICS check that is required under 594. It isn't that background checks are bad, it's that 594 is bad. You've got, let me lay it out for you. There are a lot of people in the audience who already know this because they've gone into the local police department or the sheriff's office. And they don't get a NICS check, they actually get fingerprinted. They are identified as to who exactly they are. Now that is very different than an electronic background check. So now somebody with a concealed pistol license in the state of Washington has been thoroughly backgrounded. Law enforcement knows who they are. They know that the record is clean. Why? What he was asking is, why can't they then take that CPL and have that legitimize the transfer? But no, you should be backgrounding the person, not the transfer. It's 594 just does not make sense.
We have about 100 people in this room, and everybody wants to ask a question, it seems, so we're going to get to as many as possible. After I get to this gentleman's question, I'm going to have to check in with John at home because a lot of folks are weighing in on social media. Sir, please tell us who you are, where do you live, and what is your question?
Good evening, the panelists. My name is Rick Gorman. I live in Bellevue, and I'm a veteran, and I exercise my rights under the Second Amendment. Last weekend, I went shooting. It's about transfers. Last weekend, I went shooting on public land, which is entirely legal, with my adult daughter's boyfriend. He fired my firearms. From what I read in I-594, I just committed a felony under I-594. And my question is, why as a law-abiding citizen would I be a felon simply by exercising my rights? And am I losing my rights under 594?
And before we answer it, by the way, I hope that boyfriend understood who was in charge. That's the way it is with dads and daughters.
My daughter was in charge.
Ralph?
Yeah. You know, we're going to hear so much tonight about transfers, and I don't think that's the issue. But what I will say, is that you have King County Republican prosecutor Dan Satterberg said all this chatter and dribble about transfers is hot air. There are no problems with transfers in this bill. This is King County Republican prosecutor Dan Satterberg who's refuting all these problems. In your case, you're not going to get charged with a felony unless there is an intent to circumvent the law. And I don't see any intent. But I want to go back a little. Here's the big question here. Over the last 10 years in Washington state, 6,000 people have died from gun violence in this state. 6,000 people. Now, are we going to just say that's acceptable collateral damage? Or are we going to try to do common sense programs like denying gun rights to felons and terrorists and those on domestic violence charges from getting guns? This is an important first step, and you're all trying to play gotcha with this transfer nonsense.
I want to bring Phil Watson back into the conversation.
Well, I'd like to defer to my colleague, Phil Shave. He really wanted to have a response to this.
The notion that Prosecutor Satterberg read and understood this 18 pages is absurd. He did not. Because if he had actually read this, if he were a working prosecutor, and we have at least one in the audience, he would know that everything hinges upon the definition of what a transfer is. And it is very specific. It is just a change of possession of that firearm. This is not about background checks. This is an attempt to crush recreational shooting.
A lot of great questions and a lot of disagreement of opinion from our panelists. But right now, social media is just as heated. So let's check with our social media desk. John, what's the latest?
Mark, yeah, it's been absolutely fast and furious out here. We've been taking a look at 594. It's been a lot of topics of conversation, but there's also 591, and that's one of those laws that, if passed and the initiative that would move forward, has a lot of questions for a lot of people about what we're doing with the law that already exists. Tess asks, I-591 claims to protect gun owners from the government confiscating guns. Has this been a problem in Washington? Then you've also got other questions about that initiative, saying in turn, when having other folks involved, we've got Cornelia chiming in, and she says 591 talks about illegal seizure of guns. Are we already protected by the Fourth Amendment in our state constitution? A lot of people say, hey, this is fear-mongering, this is worrisome. People are going to read the way that initiative is worded and forget that the laws are already on the books. What do our panelists have to say about that?
You know, it's a great question. I want to follow up with Rebecca, because if you take a look at what's happened in the federal courts in the last few years, there have been a lot of decisions that have gone both ways on these issues and so forth. Is there concern about any kind of infringement, or is this acceptable, and would this pass muster to your knowledge?
Is the question whether 591 would pass muster?
594. How many use 594?
Oh, 594 is very, very simple. It applies the exact same, it applies the same system that many in our audience here today and at home have used for many years to purchase guns at gun stores. The example that the last gentleman gave of handing a gun to his daughter's boyfriend while they're shooting, that simply is not a transfer, and you don't have to take my word for it. The FBI has been very clear that that would not be a transfer.
Well, this is a key point. This is not a bill that was created in a vacuum. This is a bill that's been in place in California and Oregon for 10 or 15 years. And all this fear and uncertainty and doubt that the other side is creating is hocus pocus, because we don't have these problems, these gotcha problems with transfers in these other states. So this law has been vetted for over a decade, hundreds of thousands of events, and we haven't seen people thrown in jail because of, quote, transfers. So they know that 87% of people want this bill to pass, including a plurality of NRA members from our own polls. So they're trying to create confusion.
All right. I'm I'm going to shift gears for just a moment because Rebecca had mentioned something, as did Phil Watson, and it addressed an issue that hopefully we can explore a little bit here. And I'd like to read something to our audience here and our viewers at home. This appeared in USA Today newspaper in January 6th of 2013. I'm just going to read a portion of the article. After Newtown, Connecticut, parents cried out, "What's making our children kill?" But it is not our children killing. It is our sons. All but one of the 62 mass killings in the past 30 years was committed by boys or men. We respond by blaming guns, our inattentiveness to mental health, violence in the media, or video games, or family values. Yes, all are players, but our daughters are able to find the same guns in the same homes, are about as likely to be mentally ill, have the same family values, and are exposed to the same violence in the media. Our daughters, however, do not kill. Why the difference? Now, I have a gentleman here who's worked in the mental health field in some respects, so I want to see if we can explore this. Do you have any sense as to why? Because our concern here, and all the panelists, we want to stop gun violence, and we look at those tragic events, and it horrifies all of us. But if the article is correct, why is it sons are killing and our daughters aren't?
Okay, I'm going to really annoy a bunch of people with this. Number one, in the last 50 years, every single mass shooting, the person has been on psychotropic medications. That means a shrink has put him on one of 50 or so different drugs for mental problems. Most of these shooters are young, high school or just shortly out of high school. In the last 25 years, our school systems have demasculinized boys in school. They have come up with this concept of all students are the same, and therefore boys who act like wild animals need to be tranked rather than treated like a rough, tough boy. And so these kids are on meds. On meds, one of the things that happens is you lose a lot of the control that you have. So they're upset, they're wild about something, and they don't have anything controlling them anymore. They fly off the handle, they go crazy, they shoot, they kill, they assault.
All right, let me see if I can get the...
I worked in the wards for 5 years.
All right, let me see if I can get the audience, the panelists on this, and just to follow up, because what has been addressed is keeping guns out of the hands of the mentally ill. However, and KOMO News is not taking position here. However, we do want to point out there are HIPAA and federal regulations that prohibit anyone from knowing what goes on in someone's medical background. So, Rebecca, how do we bridge that if we want to keep guns out of the hands of the mentally ill, but we don't access the records because we can't? Is there a way to bridge that gap?
So right now, what the federal law says is that if you've been involuntarily committed for 14 days or more, you're prohibited from possessing a firearm. But as I said earlier, there's not one solution. There's not one single solution for all gun violence. I would look forward to working with Phil Watson on policies around mental health because that absolutely is a part of the solution. But that does not mean that we shouldn't do the common sense measure of 594 that closes a loophole that will stop many dangerous people, felons, domestic abusers, and the very seriously mentally ill from accessing guns today.
Phil Watson?
There's a lot that goes into this issue. I'm not a mental health professional. I can't speak as eloquently as the gentleman has about those issues. But I think the parts that I have an issue with a bill like 594 isn't necessarily the background checks for gun sales. It's all the other stuff in there. For instance, the extended waiting period that was just a couple weeks ago found unconstitutional in California, the extended 10-day waiting period, even if you already own a firearm. So I think there's a lot of problems with 594. We're going to have to, in my opinion, sort that out and really focus on the things that we can agree on, and not stuff that we want to add on top of the pile instead of addressing the real issues.
All right. I want to bring up Phil Shave and Ralph back in this conversation, but I'm going to shake things up a little bit. Let's say, for sake of argument, that on the first Tuesday in November, both I-591 pass and I-594 pass. What happens then? I'll start off with Phil Shave. Because the bills then, I mean, in many respects, you would think they kind of cancel each other out. But what happens? What do we do?
I do not think that both initiatives can survive or be reconciled. They're so very different. But I've looked at the Washington State Constitution, and I can't figure out what happens. I am not expert on that. I can only guess that the courts and possibly the legislature will end up having to fight it out and figure out what stands and what does not.
And we'd love it at KOMO News if that happened, by the way. It'd be a good news day for us. Ralph?
So what will happen is the Supreme Court is going to adjudicate this of the state of Washington. And this is a rare instance, but what's happened in the past in other states often is that the Supreme Court looks to the will of the people to decide. You've got conflicting issues here, and the one that usually tallies the highest is the one that'll be the law of the land in Washington State. It's not a certainty, but that's a likelihood.
All right, and before I follow up with this gentleman's question, just want to find, I understand, do we have a prosecutor in the audience or a former prosecutor anywhere in here?
Yeah, that'd be me.
Okay, so we'll get a chance to speak to this gentleman, I hope. We just drafted you, by the way. Sir, please tell us who you are, where do you live, and what is your question?
Hi, I'm Dennis Brislon from Woodinville. I happen to be an attorney, a veteran, and for the last 4 years I've been working on and off with ATF, and I've been lecturing to attorneys around the country about the possession and transfer of firearms. So my experience, sir, is very different from yours. I can tell you that the roughly 1,000 lawyers I've been involved in continuing legal education are very concerned about what we term the accidental felony. I know from the ATF General Counsel's office that federal prosecutors have prosecuted folks who met all the elements of the crime, but to me were simply neighbors caught at the wrong time and the wrong place and a bad fact pattern. So there's a political reality to prosecution, which my colleague can speak to. But the issue the question I want to ask you is this. I read the exceptions extremely carefully. First of all, sharing on private property, there's no exception for. There's no exception for my friend and I's sport shooting, as that gentleman referenced.
And your question is?
And so I want to know, how does 594 protect against the likelihood of an accidental felony being committed by a grieving widow who is unaware of gun transfer laws or someone else?
Let me go ahead and get a response in. Ralph?
Again, it wouldn't be the first time that attorneys try to, create fear, uncertainty, and doubt for their own benefit so they can make money. But the key thing here, accidental felonies, is the issue of intent. There's no such thing as an accidental felony in this bill. And one of the reasons this is 18 pages because the first 6 pages define in the utmost degree, so there's not any ambiguity. But the key issue here is intent. If somebody did not have the intent to circumvent this law, there will be no conviction. That is right in the bill.
Actually, it's not.
All right, hold on. I want to get a quick response from Phil Watson.
The problem is there is such a thing called prosecutorial discretion. And I think the gentleman standing up right now is a prosecutor, in fact, and he can speak very, very eloquently towards that.
But Dan Sandberg can't, apparently.
Excuse me, Ralph. I think the prosecutor that's in the room is an expert, and we should hear what he has to say.
All right. One of the things that we hear is a concern, and I don't know if it's legitimate or not, but that people who do violate the law sometimes are not prosecuted. And so an argument is made, depending on which side of the debate you're on, that we don't hold the people who break the law accountable, so what's the point of another law? Can you just talk about the issues that were raised earlier about suggestions were made by panelists about people who have broken various gun laws in the past and have been prosecuted?
Well,
I'm sorry, please tell us who you are, where do you live?
My name is John Rodabaugh. I live up in Linwood. I mean, the gentleman that had the question about all these people who were denied firearms based on the NICS check, well, that act by those people in attempting to buy a firearm was a federal felony. And so ask yourself, how many of those 25,000 felons were prosecuted? How many of those 6,000 domestic abusers? How many of those 1,000 mentally ill people? How many of those people were subject to a federal felony prosecution for their act of attempting to buy a firearm? It is a felony to make a false statement on a 4473, the form that you fill out in order to purchase a firearm. And they would have had to claim to not be felons in order to be subject to the NICS check, because the NICS check is only done after the form is filled out. Prosecutors have discretion, as people have pointed out. Mr. Fascitelli has said a number of times that this particular law requires that a person have an intent to break it, and that's not true. If you look at Section 9 of your initiative, it says that a person has to act knowingly. Acting knowingly and acting with intent are two different legal standards. Acting knowingly is a much lower legal standard, that is a person knew or should have known that what they were doing was illegal. That's a reasonable person, and that's decided by a judge and a jury after the prosecution has already commenced. So when you sit there and say, oh no, it requires an intentional violation, that's a lie. It doesn't require an intentional violation. A knowing violation is enough.
All right, let me get a quick response. Now, thank you. Right. And Ralph, let's just say, for sake of argument, that what he said is correct. Would simply changing the language then make it a better provision, and then we're okay?
Not correct. This is again a gray area between knowingly and stuff. I'm going to defer to Dan Satterberg. He's a Republican prosecutor of King County. He's highly respected. My friends on the right have dissed him because he's not in line with what they're saying. But I'm going to defer in this debate between prosecutors to Dan Satterberg, a Republican lead prosecutor for King County.
Phil?
There's some misconceptions out here, and I think one of them was introduced with a question about gun violence. The phrase gun violence is used basically to bring the gun into the violence issue. I think appropriately we've talked about mental illness because that is an appropriate discussion. Washington State, the murder rate is half of what it was in 1994. Half. And of those murders, 50 to 60% are committed with firearms. The rest are committed with hands and feet and clubs and cars. Okay, so we're talking about the state of Washington, not New York and not Chicago, and this is one of the safest states in the United States. Our murder rate, our rate of violence is equivalent to those little states like Maine and New Hampshire out on the East Coast. There is no epidemic of gun violence in the state of Washington.
All right. Ralph, hold that thought for a moment because I want to get it.
This is a big point. This is a critical point of the night because what my friends on the right do, they ignore suicide. And we have 600 gun deaths a year, okay? 600 gun deaths a year, and they ignore suicide. And we lose a person a day to suicide in this state. And we know those states that have approved background checks on all sales, their level of suicide by firearm goes down by 49%.
Quick follow-up, Phil, and then I need to move on.
We found an area in which we agree. His statistics are wrong because he includes suicides. That is not gun violence. We have states, in fact, we have a neighboring state in which the citizens have passed a law allowing doctors to assist people in suicide. Now, I tell you that the issue, if you look at the problem of suicide and guns, it is a problem that escalates with age, and it is almost exclusively male.
You are so wrong. It's a problem of children under 25, and when there's a gun in the home, you're 5 times more likely to have a completed suicide. And to infer that suicide is not gun violence, I don't even want to touch it, because it puts you in a category that's not of this race sometimes.
All right, I want to leave it there for a moment, because I suspect we're going to hear more about this tonight. And before I check in with what our viewers think about this, I want to get another question from our audience here. Please tell us who you are, where do you live, and what is your question?
My name is Cheryl Stumbo, and I live in Seattle. My question is for Phil Watson. In addition to law enforcement, I-584 is supported by a diverse coalition, including the state PTA, the Faith Action Network, the League of Women Voters, and local chapters of the National Association of Mental Illness and the National Physicians Alliance. And I, in fact, work with survivors. Can you name any statewide education or public health organization that supports your initiative?
And before they respond, I understand you have some personal experience.
I do.
Can you please tell us about that?
I am a survivor of gun violence. I was shot, critically injured at the Jewish Federation of Greater Seattle a little over 8 years ago.
Okay, and I'm sorry, and your question was to Phil Watson?
My question was to Phil Watson.
Phil Watson, please, and then I want to get a response from Rebecca.
Well, Initiative 591 is supported by the largest law enforcement group in the state, the Washington Council of Police and Sheriffs. It's supported by the Washington State Law Enforcement Firearms Instructors Association, and we've got a lot of people from around the state that are hunters, community leaders, police officers, law enforcement. We have 9 county sheriffs that are supporting our initiative, and the Washington State Association of Police and Sheriffs also said no to 594. And I think it's important for us to recognize the people that are responsible for policing the streets in Washington State are saying 594 has a lot of legal problems, okay? It's going to entrap people that are not meaning to commit crimes to begin with. It does a lot that doesn't have to do with background checks for gun sales. And quite honestly, although I really do sympathize with anybody that's had an issue with any type of violence, the people that are responsible for keeping the streets safe, not only me and you, but the police, are agreeing with 591 and not agreeing with 594.
Just quick follow-up, because our audience member did ask about mental health. If you can address that quickly, and then I want to bring Rebecca back in the conversation.
I didn't catch that part of it. Could you please repeat it?
If I ask you just quickly repeat that.
The question was, does your initiative have the support of any statewide organizations in the public health or mental health arena that support your initiative?
On the I-591.
Well, I'm not aware that either initiative addresses public health or mental health.
Okay, I want to bring Rebecca back in the conversation. We haven't heard from you in a few minutes.
Sure. So, there is only one initiative on the ballot in November that is going to keep guns out of the hands of dangerous criminals, domestic abusers, and the dangerously mentally ill, and that's Initiative 594. And that's why there is such a diverse group of prosecutors, the League of Women Voters, the PTA, moms, grandmas, faith leaders. Initiative 594 sprung up from a broad coalition that we believe represents the majority of Washingtonians who want to take this common sense step towards reducing gun violence in our state.
And I'm going to ask the rest of our panelists to hold their thoughts a moment, because right now social media is blowing up. People at home want to be a part of this entire debate and discussion, a lot of questions they want to ask and statements they want to make. So let's check in with our social media desk. John, what do you have for us?
Well, we've got people asking for some specifics out there. They've talked a lot about the meaning and what it means for them personally and the passion that they have, but they want to know a little bit about the statistics out there. Jocelyn talks to us, how many other states have background checks like I-594? Are they working there? We've heard about California and Oregon. There are some others that do some more. We had Joy check in with us as well, saying, did you work with Washington law enforcement in writing 594? And that also gets to the point of the mental health issues for 591 and others, as far as the stakeholders who were involved, mental health experts, those law enforcement agencies, prosecutors. What role did they play in writing both of the bills?
It's a great question, and I want to follow up with Ralph. We haven't had chat with you for a few minutes. When it comes to all these initiatives, whether it's I-591 or I-594, whether it's Washington State or anywhere, we're in a day and an age where it seems like you have to get broad consensus on any kind of legislation in order to get it passed. Can you talk about at least the groups that are supportive of your bill and why you think that's important and why it helps? And then I'm going to get a quick response from the supporters of I-591.
Well, we don't need broad support. We do have broad support. We have 87%. And according to the poll, even people east of the mountains in eastern Washington are very much in favor. NRA families, not a majority, but a plurality. So it's like 46 to 36%. This has almost 9 out of 10 Washingtonians who vote want I-594. All we need is 51%. This will pass if people come out to vote and fully understand. And what the other side is doing is creating fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And I-591, all it is to create confusion, because I find it disingenuous that Phil's group in particular, who's trying to avoid federal government interference into their lives, and in fact have created paranoia that the government's going to come in the middle of the night and take your gun, is now looking to the federal government to save their neck on common sense gun legislation here.
All right. And Phil, before I follow up with you on 591, I do want to make it, what's apparent to everybody here is that the ultimate poll occurs on the first Tuesday in November, and then we will know where the majority of Washingtonians stand with either or both of these measures. But Phil, please follow up with I-591 and at least the groups that support your measure.
I think obviously the real poll is the people voting, and not Ralph's polls or Ralph's marketing of his initiative, which is actually supported by people like Michael Bloomberg's group, who said the Boston bombers were victims of gun violence. I think that's absolutely despicable that you're having this group come in and spend millions of dollars in our state. That Mike Bloomberg is an extremist. He's an anti-Second Amendment advocate, and quite honestly, I just think that's beyond the pale that Ralph is accepting that money and accepting that support. And
so you won't accept NRA money then, Phil, right? You won't accept them coming in.
I don't work with the NRA.
Okay.
So anyways. What I was getting to, there's a lot of issues we've addressed tonight with 594, and if there's no conflict with anything, then 594 just goes in. It has to become law for 2 years. That's the law here in Washington State. I think it's really important that we let our state legislature and our state courts have a chance to sort out the problems with 594. So it's very important that you vote for 591, even if you agree with the background check portion of 594. So it's going to be very important that you vote for 591.
All right, and by the way, for our audience and our panelists, we're about 2/3 of the way through the evening, and so we're going to get kind of our lightning round. I'm going to ask my audience members to just tighten up their questions a little bit, ask the panelists a little shorter answers so we can get to as many people as possible. We have about 80 people left in the room who want to ask questions, starting with this gentleman. Please tell us who you are, where do you live, and what is your question?
My name is Carlos Gonzalez. I'm from Seattle, Washington. And my question is, when the Federal Bureau of Investigation interviewed convicts convicted of violent gun crimes as to where they got their firearms from, more convicts obtained their firearms from friends and family through straw purchases than any other means. In fact, they obtained more guns going through the system of NICS checks than from private sales. So if we see, and private sales were less than 1%, where straw purchases were over 30 to 40%. If we see that so many more convicts and people who are doing these crimes are getting their guns from straw purchases and even through the NICS check, why are we addressing private sales when that's obviously not the problem?
Rebecca?
That's a great question, and that is one of the reasons that Initiative 594 closes the loophole by applying both to private sales and to transfers. Guns are bartered, traded every single day, and it's very important that as we're closing this loophole, we don't create another. Right now, today, if someone goes to Cabela's, tries to purchase a gun, fails that background check, all they have to do is go home and go online, and with a few clicks of their mouse, they can purchase another gun from a private person with no questions asked.
Mark, I want to answer this research because it's bogus research. Now think about it. We're asking felons where they got their guns. I mean, well, you know, in that study, 80% said, I don't know. felons are not going to tell you their secrets where they got the guns. And in most cases, felons are not getting the guns always directly from gun shows. They're getting them indirectly from those who buy at gun shows and then create a black market. So there's a two-step dance.
I want to bring Phil Shave back into the conversation.
Well, it's interesting that 594 places such an emphasis on the NICS check. The prosecutor who asked a question mentioned it. I looked up the figures, and there were like 76, 77,000 NICS failures last year. That is a lot of NICS failures. Those are people who went to a dealer and failed a check. How many prosecutions? 44 in the entire United States. Somebody who goes to a dealer or an FFL dealer, as required under 594, and fails that NICS check, walks away. Doesn't matter that they were prohibited from owning a firearm. There is no enforcement action.
We're back to the audience. Sir, please tell us who you are, where do you live, and what is your question?
My name is Aaron Nellermo. I live in Olympia, Washington. I have a question regarding suicide, as you said earlier. So you claimed that that was violence. It should be included. So given that I am a rational human being, do I not have the ability to decide my own fate?
What if you're mentally ill? I mean, people get committed for mental health reasons for two reasons: because they're a danger to themselves, i.e. suicide, or to society. So, you know, suicide in many cases is a mentally ill issue, and with the presence of a gun in connection with this, and somebody's in this vortex, this is emotional vortex, the chances of a completed suicide go sky high.
You didn't answer
Yes. So, assuming
it's got to be a lightning round question.
I'm sorry. Assuming no quality of life, do I not have the right to choose suicide?
Let me answer this then. Suicide is often very impulsive, and they've done studies that found. Oh, let me answer your question. I'm answering your question. I'm not giving you the answer you want, but I'm answering your question. They have done studies of people who survive suicide, and actually their longevity is 90% of the regular population 30 years out. So many cases, people who have an impulse to commit suicide really don't want to die. You know, and in fact, they don't. They live for many decades.
And let me just follow up. And again, here at KOMO News, we're not taking position on this, but an obvious question we want to ask, and we addressed a little bit earlier on the whole mental health issue, because if you look at both I-591 and I-594, they don't really have provisions that go at what most people would see as the heart of the mental illness issue. Because if you take a look at folks like Eric Harris, Dylan Klebold of the Columbine shooting, Sung Ho Cho of Virginia Tech, Jared Lochner of Tucson, Arizona, James Holmes of Aurora, Colorado, the list goes on and on. All of these people had mental health issues. In some cases, the guns, or maybe in all cases, the guns were acquired through legitimate means. So if we believe that when it comes to mass shootings, that it's always mental health issues, how do we fix that problem so that the ones who are mentally ill don't get access to weapons?
To make it harder for people who have mental health issues to get guns. In the case of Columbine, they bought their guns from somebody who bought the guns at a gun show, and because there was no record keeping, that person created a black market and sold them to Eric and Dylan. If they had closed the gun show in Colorado back then, there in all likelihood would not have been a Columbine. Just like in all likelihood, there might not have been a Forza Cafe where 4 policemen were shot and killed, because the individual, the felon who killed the 4 policemen, bought his gun from somebody who bought that gun from a gun show, and they bought it and resold it because there was no record keeping. So the problem with gun shows is the creation of this secondary market that eventually gets in the wrong hands, be the felons or the mentally ill.
Bring Phil Watson back to the conversation.
I'm really glad you brought that up, Ralph, because I was on a panel with Ed Troyer. He's the PIO for the Pierce County Sheriff's Office, and they did an extensive check on where Maurice Clemens bought his firearm, and they couldn't find out where it came from. So smile again, Ralph. Your nose is growing.
Yeah. Well, I can tell you where he got it from. He got him from an individual in Olympia, Washington, who had about 100 guns in his garage and was selling them as a way to make income.
That's not what Ed Troyer said.
Oh.
It was on TV.
Well, I can show you the data.
All right, and we're going to find out what this gentleman has in his mind, and then I've got to find out what the viewers have on their mind at home because they're weighing in big time in this issue. Sir, please tell us who you are, where do you live, and what is your question?
Jason Ritchie, I live in Issaquah. Very simple question. Do background checks work? And if they do, then why aren't we expanding them? And is that an unreasonable burden to put on gun owners? I'm a gun owner. I had to pass a background check. Doesn't 594 simply close a background check? Are we getting distracted?
Rebecca?
I believe we are getting distracted. 594 simply does close a loophole that exists today where when you walk into Cabela's or Big Five, they will do a background check before they sell you a gun. But as I said before, if you go home online to Arms List or another website, you can buy a gun online from a stranger or at a gun show or in a parking lot from someone with no questions asked. I-594 simply closes that loophole, and that's how we're going to keep guns out of the hands of dangerous criminals, domestic abusers, and the seriously mentally ill.
But Phil Shea, why is that not reasonable?
I don't think that anybody here has said background checks aren't reasonable. We've said 594 isn't. Now, Rebecca used the word, first time I've heard the word transfer. That is the key to what we find wrong. Now, I will tell you, this is not a crime control bill. If it were a legitimate crime control bill, law enforcement officers would be supporting it. They are not. Law enforcement is unanimously opposed to it. The other thing that keeps being repeated is the loophole. Well, surprise, there is no loophole. It is against the law to transfer a gun, private citizen or not, to anybody you believe is unqualified to possess it. It is against the law and always has been.
And before I follow up with Ralph for just a moment, I hope someone here in the audience has some knowledge on whether there's enforcement of that, because our concern is, that's been addressed here, is if people are violating existing laws, whether or not 591 and 594 get passed, beside that, are we enforcing the laws currently in place? I think we addressed it earlier, but we may have a chance to follow up if we have any other law enforcement here. But Ralph, let me bring you back in the conversation, and then I have to check in with John on social media.
I want to talk about law enforcement because there are a number of law enforcement groups here. There's WACOPs, which are the rank and file union people. There's the State Patrol, and there are police chiefs. Now, only WACOPs is supporting the Phil brothers' side on that. And the facts are these. 500 police have been killed by guns over the last 10 years. And in those states that have closed the gun show loophole, we see a reduction in death to police by more than 30%.
And by the way, I just want to correct one thing. I don't think the Phils are really brothers.
We're long-lost brothers.
But I know at home, people are just as passionate about this issue as they are here in Studio B. So let's check with our social media desk. John, what do you have for us?
Well, having that little moment of levity there talking about family, that's actually a big question that we've been getting from a lot of people is what do you do within your own family and the members who have guns? We've got Stephen weighing in. Could I restore my grandfather's old non-antique hunting rifle? It seems illegal unless it's gifted to me. Then another issue we've been hearing from other folks out there is loaning a firearm to a family member to go hunting without you, legal under I-594. These are some of the biggest questions that we've had tonight. These are the ones that people want specific answers to and a lot of clarity. Guys?
Right. You know, all right, I want to follow up with Phil Shea because some of the biggest disagreement here appears to be in the whole issue of transfer. And we're looking at, and Ralph started off the evening, he talked about the antique weapons and so forth. Is there a gray area? Should we be concerned? Are there issues that need to be addressed on either side?
No, there's no gray area. 594 lists a specific number of exceptions. And in a law, when you write a law and you list the exceptions, those are the only exceptions. It is not a gray area. The question regarding the loan of a rifle to go hunting, no, you can't do that. That is a transfer. Okay? That requires Grandpa to go down, find an FFL dealer, transfer the gun, and at the end of the hunting season, transfer it back if he wants it back. And the second part of that question, again, it's not allowed without an FFL transfer of that firearm. There are traps in 594, and they're primarily set up for families, survivors who inherit firearms, recreational shooters, coaches, safety trainers. Those are the people who are at risk because of the transfer language in 594.
I'm getting worried, Mark, that Phil lives in a parallel universe, because he said there's no loophole, and now he's saying all these traps are set. Dan Satterberg, King County Republican prosecutor, said this is all nonsense. In fact, you can go hunting and you can give it to a family member while you're hunting, and there's no repercussion to that. That is all a legal exception.
That is not true.
Right.
The actual language,
Yeah.
the actual language is while hunting. And we have law enforcement officers in the audience who have applied laws. We have a prosecutor. He will tell you that means while hunting. That means in the field. So I can hand my rifle to my buddy to go across a fence for safety, but back at home, can I give it to a relative, a friend, so he can go hunting? The answer is no.
And I'm going to remind the audience to please show respect to all of our panelists, even if you disagree with them. We appreciate their being here and expressing their opinions and sharing their knowledge with us, so please show the respect they deserve. I'd like to find out what this young lady has in her mind. Please tell us who you are, where do you live, and what is your question?
My name is Stephanie Kearns. I live in Kirkland, and I am a firearms instructor. I've been teaching for 15 years, and mostly women, in both self-defense and firearms training. I'm also an owner of West Coast Armory North Range and a gun store. And one of the things that I want to talk about, and I kind of want to look at Rebecca when I say this, is because women in the last probably 5 years have really been empowered by guns. They've been coming to classes. You talked about how there are more boys committing mass shootings. I can't address that, but I can tell you that women are more afraid of guns, and so it takes them a while to be able to come and seek out training. And I do believe, and just along with that first question that we had, training facilities will be affected by this. A transfer, it will be a transfer when I am teaching a woman because she wants to be empowered herself regarding making a choice if she wants to own a gun or not, or use it for self-defense.
And your lightning round question is?
Yes, is that how can you prevent women, because it is going to prevent women, from being able to seek out training. And I'm sorry, I have to say this. I was walking in here and the woman said to me, where do you do? And I said, I'm a firearms trainer. And she had a button on it said, Women or Mothers for Change. She said, oh, I want to get a group of women to come to your range to go shooting. They won't be able to do that.
All right, Rebecca. Thank you. And Rebecca, I'm going to broaden the issue a little bit because what's been dominating the news, not just sports, but all of news recently, is domestic violence. There are some who argue, and there's both sides of the issue, there are some who argue that some women want to be armed to protect themselves from whether it's an estranged boyfriend with a restraining order and so forth. Does this create problems for them, or is this just an easy part of the process and they still can get the weapons that they need if they have to protect themselves?
So Initiative 594 is about keeping guns out of the hands of dangerous people, and it will not impact any of the training or the safety training you talked about doing, because simply handing a gun to someone for a demonstration or to shoot is not a transfer.
It does say that it is.
But
in your initiative, though, it does.
The FBI has said that that is not a transfer. But I do want to talk about, I would like to talk about domestic violence because I think that is a very important issue. What we know in states that go beyond just the background checks at gun stores that have closed this loophole is that you see women killed by guns by their domestic partners or spouses, that number is reduced by 38% in those states, and that is an important number to remember. That's 38% of women who have been protected because they've closed this loophole. So it absolutely does impact women. It impacts survivors of domestic violence, and it keeps guns out of the hands of domestic abusers.
And Phil Watson, let's follow up because, again, it's been the national news story for several days now, domestic violence. So if we want to help save women, and it's generally women are the victims of domestic violence, would this help save those women and put them in a safer place so they don't have abusive partners using a weapon on them?
Well, you know, I don't want to put myself in the position of trying to predict the future, but I do just want to say that I think what Ray Rice did to his significant other was despicable, and Roger Goodell was very justified in expelling him from the NFL. I think that's what we're kind of talking about.
This is I-594.
All right, we're back to the audience. That was an awkward pause. We're back to the audience. Sir, please tell us who you are, where do you live, and what is your question?
Richard Ripley. I live in Mill Creek. I'm an NRA firearms instructor. I have a specific question for Rebecca. There's an exemption in 594 for educating people under age 18, specifically written in the law, or in the initiative rather. Why is it okay to teach people who are under 18, but not okay to teach people who are over 18?
Initiative 594 won't change your ability to teach people over 18. What Initiative 594 does is apply the same system of background checks that exists today when you buy a gun from a federally licensed dealer to private sales and transfers. 594 doesn't impact your ability to train, to do safety trainings, to teach folks to shoot.
Phil Schaaf?
You can hear the problem. What Mr. Ripley just described is an exception in the law which addresses handing or transferring a firearm to somebody under the age of 18. If it's not in the law, it doesn't exist as an exception. You are assuming a lot of things that are not written into 594. And the information is there. If you read it, it's in black and white. What I am afraid of is that people will pass 594 because it's about background checks on gun sales. It isn't. It is about so many other things. And I think what Ralph is saying is, you need to pass it. Trust us. And then you'll find out what's in it.
In a moment, we'll check in with social media, but I want to find out what this young lady has to say. Please tell us who you are, where do you live, and what is your question?
Hi, my name's Kate Beck, and I live in Shoreline, Washington. And I'm pretty outraged by the conversation around the transfers. My whole job is to protect my children and keep them safe. And I want to know, if you were a convicted felon or you were a domestic abuser, where would you go to get a gun? Would you go to a licensed firearm dealer, or would you go to a private sales at armslist.com?
So, okay, so Phil Watson, so if there aren't those background checks in certain venues, wouldn't that be a natural magnet for someone who wouldn't normally qualify and presumably wouldn't announce to whoever they were purchasing from that I'm not a good guy?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that 594 does a lot of things. It doesn't help the safest gun show in Washington State that already does background checks stay in business. It shuts it down. And quite honestly, if you're a criminal and you're hell-bent on committing a crime, you're just gonna get the gun or steal it illegally, or if you're just going to go to Idaho or Oregon to buy the gun anyway. So if you're really a criminal or a terrorist, you're going to try to buy or get the gun or steal it or any way you possibly can. And so while this is simply a background check on a sale, it doesn't get to the person's real intent. And sometimes people have intent that's bad. That's why we call these types of people criminals.
Hold that thought for a moment, Ralph, because please.
This is important. First of all, in California, universal background checks has minimal impact on the attendance at gun shows there. Minimal impact. So they are good precedents, not just for this law, but for the business successes of gun shows, and they're alive just as they were before that. And
where in California have you been to a gun show, Ralph?
I read about it, and I've been to gun shows here.
Okay.
I read about it. I read. And we've seen no impact on gun shows there. The other thing you mentioned, so we have two producers of gun shows in this state. We have Washington Arms Collectors. They do a one-time background check. They do not do a background check at the point of sale. So that means you could have passed a background check 5 years ago, and then you're committed for domestic violence 3 years later, and you could still buy a gun without a background check. Then we have another group called Knutson. There's no background checks at all. There's no background checks at all. Neither of these groups do background checks every time at the point of sale.
Not true.
All right. Things are heating up here in Studio B, but they're really heating up on both Facebook and Twitter. So let's go to our social media desk. John, what do you have for us?
Well, this was one of those questions that was difficult to get an answer to earlier, and it deals with some of the concerns in the law about 591. I-591 claims to protect gun owners from government confiscating guns. When has this been a problem in Washington? Is this just fear-mongering and saber-rattling by some of those with 591? What's the answer there?
What do you think, Rebecca?
I think it is. Their confiscation has not been a problem in Washington state. What Initiative 591 is about, it's about two things. One is about creating confusion, and the other is that it actually rolls back some of our current background checks. The very background checks that Phil Shave spoke about earlier as being so critically important. Those that check local law enforcement for the most up-to-date information about domestic violence restraining orders, about mental health commitments. Under Initiative 591, we're not just not able to close this loophole, we're actually taking a step backwards in what kind of background checks we're doing and how we're protecting the public today. There's one initiative on the ballot that's going to help protect Washingtonians, help reduce gun violence, and that's Initiative 594, and 591 is simply a step in the wrong direction.
Phil Shave, your response?
Well, 591 is a clear statement of rights. And we have both a national and a state constitution which guarantee firearms rights. In fact, the constitutional guarantee here in the state of Washington is even stronger. 591 asserts that, and it also asks for uniformity in background checks and allows for improvements at the federal level that would apply here in Washington. It rolls back nothing.
So just a quick follow-up then. If the Washington State Constitution provides what you want, then the viewers don't need I-591?
The Washington Constitution does not address the NICS checks that 594 requires. Okay.
All right, let's go back to the audience. Sir, please tell us who you are, where do you live, and what is your question?
Hi guys. My name is Vincent, and I live in Seattle, Washington. I want to come from the perspective of someone who actually works in a gun store. I work for two gun stores. One is a brick and mortar store, and one I actually work at gun shows. So being an employee, at two federally licensed firearm dealers, I have to be familiar with the law. And being employed being under the eye of the federal law, I have to be very familiar with both state and federal laws.
Lightning round questions.
Okay. My question is, the NICS system is very broken as is. I mean, we've seen the shooter of Aurora and the shooter at VTech get their guns after passing background checks. Their information was not transmitted, them being mentally ill. Their information was not transmitted to the NICS system like it should have been. But plenty of guys who pass these background checks become criminals after and never get the chance to be checked after these initial background checks. They commit a crime.
Your lightning round question is?
Okay. Is expanding an already broken system really going to help things as opposed to fixing the system? And I want to ask the audience too, how many of you guys actually know what goes to a background check?
All right, I won't have time to get to the entire audience because I have to fly to another city. However, but I want to follow up. Actually, Ralph, If assuming that the NICS system is broken, is that perhaps the first and most important step that we should be taking in order to fix that system so that we are confident and comfortable that it works well?
It is not broken. It's not perfect. Once again, I think the fellows on that side are trying to make perfect the enemy of the good. NICS is a good system. It's being improved daily. And we know that because it stopped in this state, I believe, tens of thousands of people who shouldn't have gun rights from getting their guns. So the NICS system is good. It's not perfect. We're working on making it better.
All right, and I'm going to move on for a moment because I know we're running short on time. I want to get to as many questions as possible. Please tell us who you are, where do you live, and what is your question?
My name is Pamela Van Swearingen. I live in Edmonds, Washington, north of Seattle. I am an attorney, and I have a question, but I absolutely am bursting to set it straight. I have Initiative 594 right here, and because so much has been said and misstated that I just must set it straight for everybody who's watching and listening, that it says right here in the new Section 3, Part 3, Sub F, the temporary transfer of a firearm, which is an exception to this. One of those temporary exceptions, which is perfectly lawful without a criminal background check, is sub little 2, if the temporary transfer occurs and the firearm is kept at all times at an established shooting range authorized by the governing body of the jurisdiction in which such range is located. So I need to throw that out there.
Your question is?
My question, though, is this, and this is for Mr. Shea. I hope I've got your name right. I am concerned that you and other statements I've heard tonight have represented the view of ignoring the reality and importance that when criminal background checks stop purchases from people who are ineligible to have them, convicted felons.
I need a lightning round
We know
question.
who those
I'm
people
running
are.
out of time.
And when it stops that purchase, and potentially, do you not recognize, and do the people who are so opposed to 594 not recognize that when we stop those illegal purchases, that in itself has the potential to be stopping injury, stopping domestic violence, and stopping killing by people who should never have firearms and which our law presently prohibits from having
Let's see if we
them.
can get a response because I'm running short on time. So, Phil, Phil Shea, the question was put to you.
Well, you said it. They're illegal purchases. They're already illegal. You're not going to stop a criminal by passing another law. I thank you for reading that section, that exception, because you read it exactly as it's written. And it says, and you can look at it, if that firearm is kept at all times at that range. Firearms are not kept at the range. That exception is meaningless. The firearms,
about education and learning.
the firearms are not kept at the range. They leave with their owners. That exception means nothing. And furthermore, you read the second half of that, which says at an approved range. Most transfers do not take place at an approved range, and we don't know who that authorizing body is because it is not defined in the law. This is exactly the problem with 594. It's got an exception, and it doesn't apply to anything. That exception is meaningless, and I'm glad you read it.
All right, and we're gonna move on here in a moment. I want to bring Ralph back into the conversation, but then we really have to keep all of our answers shorter because I'm going to try to get a few more questions in before we run out of time for the evening. But Ralph, I want to bring you back into the conversation.
Again, I go back to Dan Satterberg. You know, this is they are trying to create these exceptions, this fear and doubt about transfers. We have a King County Republican prosecutor who says there's no problem with transfers. We have the experience in Oregon and California that set a precedent for 10 to 15 years. There's no problem with precedent. So, you know, you guys are making an extreme case. You have to look at the cost-benefit analysis. 40% of guns out there are bought via private sales. That's a loophole that we need to close.
Your nose is growing again, Ralph.
Phil, 15 seconds, and I've got to move on because I want to get some more questions in before we run out of time.
15 seconds. Oh, move on.
All right, sir, please tell us who you are, where do you live, and what is your question?
My name is Eric Miller, and I'm from Linwood, Washington.
And your question, your lightning round question.
I come from California. I've been up here 10 years. We have background checks. It didn't change any of the murder or homicides in Oakland, where I'm from, at all. In fact, the gun murders have gone up. How are you going to address straw purchases with this background check? Because that's where all the criminals are getting their guns.
Rebecca, I want to bring Rebecca back in the conversation.
So today we have, it's really a superhighway, not even a loophole, where it's completely legal for someone to sell or transfer or trade a gun from a private person to a private person with no background checks, no questions asked. 594 closes that loophole. It gives our law enforcement an additional tool. It is designed to keep guns out of the hands of dangerous people. Is it going to stop every criminal from getting every gun? No. There's no one thing that we can do that will stop every criminal from getting a gun.
Law enforcement from California. The background check isn't saving lives because they're doing straw purchases.
But sir, we know that in states that do have closed this loophole, we know that law enforcement deaths by gun are 38% lower.
I come from California.
All right, all right, I want to get, all right, there's like, ladies and gentlemen, there's like 5 minutes left. Let's pretend for the last 5 minutes that I'm in charge. And I want to bring Phil back into the conversation. Phil Watson, I need a quick response from you, and then I want to get another question before we run out of time.
Well, first of all, I'd really like to point out that a lot of what we've been talking tonight isn't exactly the background checks necessarily on gun sales. We wanted to come to the table with the 594 campaign when they first started. They refused to talk to us. Nick Hanauer refused to talk to us. He was the primary funder of the 594 campaign. So they're interested in talking, but not to us and not the entire community. They're interested in telling you what they want you to hear, not what the entire community wants to be heard.
All right, we're back to the audience. Please tell us who you are, where do you live, and what is your question?
My name is Owen Welling from Graham, Washington. My question is, we talk about the importance of keeping guns out of the hands of criminals. Criminals, by definition, don't care about the law, don't care about the penalties. We had a criminal in the case of Colorado who drove past several theaters where he knew that there would be possibility of armed defense.
Okay, your lightning round question is?
Is it more effective that we instill in the minds their fear of retribution, that they know what the consequences are for their immediate actions? This man is not going to stop. We see in Japan that people commit suicide even though they don't have the weapons. Why are we not providing means of an effective defense instead of trying to keep them away from an object?
All right. Ralph? Ralph, I've got about a minute for you and a quick minute for a response.
We have 600 gun deaths a year. Okay, background checks is not going to bring that down to zero, but it's an important step in the right direction. We know that by the examples of other states. Why should we make it easy on criminals? Let's make it tougher. When you close the private sales, the black market price goes up. You know, and some of these criminals are not geniuses, so let's not make it easy for them. Let's not have that super highway for illegal gun purchases. It's a step in the right direction, not a panacea.
I want to. And Phil, I'll leave you with the last word.
Let me give you a little comparison. The state of Washington has approximately 500,000 concealed pistol licenses. This is a half a million people who are authorized by the state, totally backgrounded, to carry a firearm. We had last year we have stats for, we had 130 homicides, not all with firearms. City the same size, Washington, D.C. You know how many concealed pistol licenses they issue? 0. How many murders? Oh, well, I think it's like 600. So what's the comparison? Are guns the problem? No, guns are not the problem.
And I've run out of time there, Phil. Ralph, I'm going to have to leave it there. Now, tonight you've witnessed spirited and passionate debate, open and honest discussion, a lot of disagreement. But you know, tonight, we did it peacefully. And although there's disagreement on a variety of issues here, I think I can say this on behalf of everyone here. We all want the same thing. We want to ensure the safety and security of our families, our children, our neighborhoods, and our communities. That, I'm sure we all agree. On behalf of our panel, our live audience here, and of course the fantastic crew of KOMO News, I'd like to thank you at home for joining us. Make certain you continue the debate with us on Facebook tonight, and ensure you watch the late news for coverage of tonight's town hall and all of today's breaking news. As always, we salute our military, law enforcement, firefighters, EMTs, and other emergency personnel for their service to their communities and our nation. I'm Mark Hyman. Good night.